Hi everyone, I'm here with Jo Hartland. Jo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Jo Hartland. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a doctor and senior lecturer at the University of Bristol Medical School. I trained as a clinician, so I graduated from Cardiff in 2013 and had 5 years in the NHS before leaving to take up a role more focused on predominantly undergraduate education and how we bring the voices of marginalised people into healthcare curriculums.
That's great. Could you tell us a little bit more about what made you want to start working in the field of healthcare inequalities and representation in the medical curriculum?
Okay, so how did I get into it? I think I was always vaguely interested in the topic. I'm someone who thinks relatively black and white about the world. I'm aware that my approach to things is often is maybe not always the most neurotypical. I tend to see things as right or wrong, black and white. There's injustice and justice. And so I think I've always been driven towards conversations around that. At medical school, I saw in a number of different ways absences from the curriculum. And I also saw what was represented in the curriculum. And one of the things that for me was clearly not in the curriculum was LGBT people. And as an openly gay medical student, that was something that I kind of wanted to address. There was very few gay medical students in my year. I think there was only like 2 people who were out. More have come out since, which tells you something. But simultaneously, there were also negative experiences at medical school. So like I had to put in a complaint about a consultant who'd retired would come in to do a guest lecture and gave out a textbook that he'd written, which was how to practice medicine according to Christ. And within it, he was advocating for I'm laughing for the podcasters because of Asia's face as I said that. Yeah, he was sort of advocating for how to cure LGBT people, gay people specifically, as well as things like to not give pain relief in childbirth because of the original sin. And I brought this to the attention of the medical school at the time. It was really interesting because my colleagues, I remember us being sat on placement in a common room and like there were multiple options for this textbook around. And I was like looking through it with this increasing horror. And I kind of pointed it out to people around me and they were like, yeah, that's weird, isn't it? I was like, it's not weird. Like, it's bad. This is bad. This is a bad thing. And so I went and I brought this up and I said to the undergraduate team at the hospital we were at, are you aware of the content of this? And sort of tried to put in a complaint. And one of my friends, Neda, who was very close with me when we were on placements and is a wonderful person, did what I think is some of the best bystandership and allyship I've ever seen, which is that rather than talk for me or try to do anything on my behalf, she was just this solid statue observing in the corner, just witnessing everything. Like, do you want me there? I'm there. Like, just this sort of recording of everything, which was just so powerful for me. And yeah, eventually we did get a positive outcome. The lecturer was made to apologise and was not invited back. But it took a huge amount of work. And I was asked at the time, do I really want to be known as the problem-making gay? And my joke that I've used in a lot of places now, so I probably need a new one, is that I made a career out of being a problem-making gay. And it worked out for me. But super intimidating at the time. And I suppose that incident, along with increasing other incidences, really just raised to me that people weren't advocating for populations. They weren't challenging issues when they appeared, and they were failing to see their role as participants in issues like that, in health inequity and so on. And later, as I kind of progressed through my career, I reflect back on some of the teaching we did have at medical school and around issues of, for instance, racism in healthcare. And we did have some teaching on it, but it was mostly, if I think about it, it was like how to be racist, because they just gave you examples of racism. And it was very medically driven. It was very tick box. Here's how you diagnose racism. And it was nothing about systemic power. It was nothing about how do you be anti-racist. if you always give an example, is always, this is an example of racism. You're not teaching people how to be anti-racist. You're teaching them how to be racist, or at best, how to avoid overt racism. Same with homophobia, same with transphobia, and everything else. So, like, yeah, that was kind of what started driving me towards this. And yeah, I was really fortunate that a role came up at Bristol that I was able to apply for, and was actually not the first choice for, but I was the second choice, and I got it when the first choice backed out. And yeah, 5 years later, I've kind of been focusing, that's now become my career. So I've been able to leave clinical medicine and make that my career.
That's so interesting. I'm sorry that you experienced that whilst in medical school, because that's not acceptable, but really good on you for actually speaking up. Because I know, like I said, so many people I think are afraid of being labelled a troublemaker or a problem maker. And I think a lot of people are really intimidated by consultants and people who they view to be, even if you just see an issue on the ward or something, I feel like people are scared to, put their hand up and say that's actually not right. We shouldn't be doing that, because you don't want to get labelled a troublemaker, or, because there is that power imbalance, I suppose, isn't there, that students feel. But it's so good on you for speaking up about it, and also having your friend there as well, just being there for you, because sometimes that's just what you need, isn't it?
I mean, very much. And I think within that conversation, it's worth recognizing that despite the labeling attached to being gay, I carried the privilege of whiteness and masculinity and everything else at the time that I was able to bring through, and my disability hadn't really manifested at that point. And so, like, there was a huge amount of privilege, I guess, I brought to the conversation, which made it harder for them to ignore me. It was really uncomfortable. It was not a fun experience, but I'm also aware that the positive outcome I had was in part because of the privileges I carried into it. I'm not sure that if that had been a queer black man or a disabled person or whoever, they would have had the same positive outcome. And that's something that I'm very aware of now in the work I'm doing around, and that's become more obvious since coming out as genderqueer and having the interesting thing of how gender privilege plays out in different scenarios depending on how you're perceived when you're in that scenario. That's an entire conversation in and of itself.
No, I think it is really good that when we're having these conversations and things, to acknowledge the privilege that you do have. And I think with Anatome as well, what we've been doing when we're taking these images, even though someone might be diverse in one particular aspect, in other aspects they might not be particularly diverse. So when we're taking images, for example, some people, even though they might have so, for example, one of our models, Tyler, he was born with one leg. But other than that, his anatomy was pretty textbook, because he's an ambassador for Gymshark. He's a personal trainer. So all of his muscles were, when we were taking photos, it was amazing. So it's interesting to see those different parts of our identities, isn't it? That they play a role in different ways.
100%. I'm a huge advocate for celebrating success and, like, those who have achieved so much in the face of potential systemic barriers that they might exist. However, as somebody with arthritis that's been around for a very long time, I'm also a huge advocate of the inclusion of disabled people who are, like, just about okay, like, we're just about fine. We don't do that much sport.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have to be that much of a success.
Yeah. I think it's about not making things kind of like a superpower, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's about acknowledging that within that field, it's there's a degree of kind of like the best way I can say is almost like a bit, right? Like, they want to see those stories, and, like, actually what they want to see is they overcame and they did this and they did that, and actually your success is always framed around your disability or your perceived disadvantage that someone might have. It couldn't even occur to them that a disability or a background that isn't of the common traditional route would be an advantage, would have, like, factored into them. Like, I don't know, there's always, like, a weird kind of message there around like, we love to see the struggle. Show us the struggle. If you can't show us the struggle, then And there's not much of a struggle in me, like just about making it to the gym twice a week.
So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about one of your other roles that you held on the Medical Schools Council EDI committee.
Yeah, so those who kind of are unaware, I guess, of what the Medical Schools Council is, so I should sort of say outright that, I'm not representing Medical Schools Council within this space, but so people are aware of what Medical Schools Council is. It's essentially an advisory group to UK medical schools and bring out guidance and help for medical schools to make sure that our education is kind of consistent and inclusive, and that we think about things like who are we admitting to medical schools. They'll have a role to play in the move to the medical licensing exam and so on. So within that, a few years ago was set up what's called the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Alliance, which is representatives from across UK medical schools, so across all 4 nations, sit in part of a reference group for Medical Schools Council on issues of equity, diversity and inclusion. We also have then an elective board that kind of meets a bit more regularly, I guess, and sort of heads up little bits of the work. I've had the privilege of being elected to that board and sitting on that board for about just over 3 years now, I think, or coming into 3 years now. And we're bringing out sort of, we do events and hold events and produce some guidance, but the main thing we're doing is bringing out a series of papers and guidances for medical schools framed around a primary document we made, which is framed around not only thinking about inclusivity in medicine, but thinking about how we challenge exclusion in medicine. So, and that comes from the fact that many of us on the group feel quite uncomfortable with inclusivity work, which relies on a degree of conformity. Like, yes, you can be included, but only when you adhere to this standard of professionalism we've pulled out of the air. So what does it look like to instead challenge the systemic exclusion of people from medicine and curriculum and so on? It's a lovely group, and the Medical Schools Council are very supportive in us undertaking different pieces of work. So if you're interested, there is a document on faith that is available now. It looks at the inclusion of students of faith and faith within curriculums in medical schools. There will be future ones coming out on issues around LGBT health and LGBT inclusion and race and ethnicity and disability and so on. Yeah, they're a great group, and it's an important group that I think what is difficult about medicine in the UK is that our medical curriculums differ so significantly from place to place. And as a result, we have a lot of discrepancy in practice. And, what we don't want is a school being known for this is the super accessible school for this issue and the super accessible school for this issue, right? We should all be doing that. So I guess that's what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I definitely think there's lots of people doing really good work, but sometimes in silos. They're doing it all separately. And it's about bringing all the good stuff people are doing together. Yeah, we should all be doing this. Let's include it.
Yeah, and I think also being really as a community, critical of the work that is upheld. So by that I mean there are institutions, I'm not going to name anybody and get in trouble, but there are schools and institutions in the UK that will claim very publicly and will hold events sort of implicating that they are really good at this topic, right? And they do all this stuff and that they include this in the curriculum. And then you look at it and you're like, oof, that really leans into some deep paternalism, or you've not really considered the angle of decolonization within the factoring into this work. Like, this is deeply replicating colonial imbalances in power. And so there's that discrepancy can sometimes exist between those who are most vocal and those who are maybe doing the best work. But it's that classic thing in medical education of the confident incompetent and the lacking in confidence competent and all that kind of stuff. The confident incompetents are many across all industry, to be fair.
Yeah, definitely. There's so much work we can do with regards to the curriculum in making it less exclusive, like you said, more inclusive, more diverse, and just thinking, I think, a bit more about history. I think we forget a lot of that when we are teaching things. We don't necessarily consider the history behind the investigations that we use or the rationales for the drugs we prescribe, because as students, you expect what you're taught to be gospel. You take
Mhm.
that and you are taught that and you accept it. And then I think because students themselves feel so busy, you don't have the time necessarily to go and critically analyse the things that you're being taught. So I think it's important to present students with those opportunities within the curriculum. Because now that I've started doing research, I've realised that a lot of the times when we are including race or ethnicity in prescribing or in investigations, we really shouldn't be, because it's a social construct, not a biological one. And when you
Mhm.
understand that simple fact, you question why we're using it at all in medicine. And then you look back and you're like, because of slavery, colonialism, racism. So I definitely think there's scope for that to be included more in the curriculum.
I mean, 100%. At Bristol, I used to teach, and now my colleague Naz, who's amazing, has started taking on the teaching for what I used to be doing. And so we have a day on anti-racism for the year ones that we're kind of exploring how it changes. It's often very community-led. So a lot of the Bristol community who are affected by issues of racism in healthcare will be part of the day and the teaching. One of the things that we advocate for within that is a move towards race-conscious medicine from race-based medicine, so an acknowledgement of the impact of racism in health, but within that, the discussion of, well, like, what is race-based medicine and where did that stem from and why is that important? And so I agree. I think discussions of like history are vital. I think there's a problem inherent within it sometimes, though, where like you have to take the discussion of history from a really sound educational framework, by which I mean that it's not just enough to discuss it. You need to be explaining the relevance to students of why you're discussing it, and you need to be exploring the intersection of these forms of systemic oppression. How do race and gender connect? Like, where is the historical connection between these, and why is it that challenging one can only be done when we also challenge the other? Like, how do we acknowledge that these are based on the same pseudosciences and the same upholding of certain forms of supremacy in society? And that also is important when we start to think about how do we empower you as students? And I suppose that's one of the things that is sometimes missing from curriculums, which is that I think, kind of as you were mentioning, it's, you've been doing your own reading, your own investigating, right? And you've been seeing how flawed some of the science is. But you're the next generation of researchers and leaders in the field. And what I think we should be focusing on a bit more in undergraduate education is empowering you to be people who challenge, who are critical of systems, who are able to review the evidence and say, but sorry, why am I giving this guidance that was created in the 1940s? How have we not updated, discussions on food nutrition properly in the curriculums since then? Like, how is it so outdated, so colonial, so rooted in, I had a fascinating discussion with my case-based learning group recently, Bristol, when we were doing it around the Mediterranean diet, this concept of the Mediterranean diet and how we uphold it as like it's just gold standard. So you'll get out a free jail card for an OSCE, right? Like, recommend the Mediterranean diet. You've covered your bases, despite the fact that that is, one, really expensive in the UK to eat in the way that it is. So actually what you're doing is setting a patient up to fail, which is not going to make them want to engage in their health. And two, it has a complete lack of cultural sensitivity to both the dietary needs of somebody who may be from a different culture, but also recognizing that all cultures have healthy and unhealthy food.
Yeah.
And upholding a European standard of eating above all others is not the kind of global medicine that we should be aiming towards today.
No, definitely. That's very interesting. I always come away from these podcasts thinking about new things and new perspectives that people talk to me about them, which is the great thing about doing this, because Yeah. I was never even considered it. You're just like, oh yeah, Mediterranean diet, healthy. But then we actually think food is food, isn't it? Food is fuel, and that's that. And as long as you have balance, yeah, like you said, it's upholding kind of a European standard of doing things that's the best way of doing things.
And if we look at, if you want to take a global health perspective for that, you can look at the outbreak of, or the increasing levels, I should say, of things like diabetes and obesity and issues related to that across sort of global south countries. It is a direct result of loans that have been put in place with the criteria that those countries have to open their borders up to global capitalist trade, and it will have agreed companies by which they will be involved in it. And you see a proliferation of Western food in those countries. Mm. Those Western food types are bad. It's unhealthy food. And it creates further and subsequent ill health, which is interesting because part of those loan agreements will also include opening up their health service to capitalism as well. So that feels a little bit like, sort of making the product and the demand all in one go, right? We're gonna open up the health service, and we're also going to help the population become more unhealthy. And maybe that's a little bit too cynical, but I don't think it's far off.
I think we see that with a lot of companies, don't we? That they do things, like you said, they make a demand for something based on that product. It's like things now people say they're not meant to last, are they?
Yeah. But I mean, we put the blame sometimes on these companies, and yet these big global companies that do that kind of work are inherently tied to socio-political climates. Those companies are the government in many circumstances, right? Like they fund it, they are part of the election campaigning, they help decide policy and stuff like that. So, you have to have that global awareness. And I just think it's interesting when we advocate for, our healthcare is, our standard of health is the best. Our idea of, when you look at knowledge production and what we value within journals, it's mostly from, well, at least in medical education, I can tell you have the big five, right? So it's like 90% of publications. No one check me on these figures because I'm trying to remember them, but are from like America, Canada, Germany, UK, and Australia. As if those are the only places doing teaching of value.
Yeah. No.
So, how we value knowledge production and like where we draw that from is really important when it comes to conversations of health and representation. Because, we invalidate, I don't remember how I got to this, but we invalidate so many different, sources of health, I guess, by only upholding one example.
Yeah, I think it is good to hear perspectives from other countries and other places. But unfortunately, sometimes, like you said, they're not really upheld as much, and it can be harder to find those resources. And I think sometimes people then take that to mean that no good work is happening in those places, which is not the case. It's just that we don't hold it to the same standard that we hold.
Exactly. We've set up the climate in which we won't hear those stories, right? Like we decided what we value, and then we go, oh, nothing valuable is coming from this place. Well, that's because you created the climate by which they have to like meet your value standards now.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting thing in medical education. So you've probably heard of the hidden curriculum, right?
Yeah.
So the hidden curriculum, if anyone isn't sure, the hidden curriculum is about those things that you teach to students that relate to more forms of implicit bias, for instance, things around behavior. It might include professionalism, but a lot of it is implied. A lot of it is kind of signaled to. There's a lot of coding in curriculums around this. But you also have something called the null curriculum, and that's about what you don't teach and therefore assign value to or not to. So that is as important as the other forms of curriculum development. So the decision to exclude things from the curriculum is a vital component of how that curriculum will be interpreted and then generated, because curriculums are only systems by which we decide what knowledge we value, because they are the knowledge that we will pass on. That's what university's curriculum is. And then it's really useful when we think about that to then think of it through a colonized lens. So in a colonized university, what is a colonized curriculum? By which I mean, where is the value that we place on people and stories and evidence bases? Because that tells you a lot about who's not going to be there. And then that tells you a little bit about what you're going to have to do to try and change that. And I guess this is probably the difference between some equalities work, some inclusivity work, and decolonizing work, which is, you have to understand when you're trying to change a curriculum to include voices, if you want to change anatomy, to include representation of different people, you also have to have a good understanding of why they're not there in the first place. Because otherwise all you're doing is a very superficial change. And it's not sustainable. The same power structures will push those people back out as soon as there's the opportunity to. As soon as that one person who's advocating for it steps out, you'll find it filters away. Or they find a way to sterilize it so that it becomes more palatable to them. So, need to find out what your underpinning reasons are. Anyway, I think you asked me like one question, sorry, and I've just gone on for like half an hour.
No, it's great. I think that links quite nicely to my next question, actually, which is about your GLAD medical school charter. So I just wanted to know a bit more about how that kind of came about and what work went into it.
Okay. So I'll define it quickly for anyone who's not kind of read it, and if you haven't, why not? So the GLAD Medical School's Charter on so-called conversion therapy practices is a document that summarizes some of the, at the time of writing, evidence about so-called conversion therapy practices in the UK globally, and then makes an argument for why medical schools should be supporting a ban, a legal ban on so-called conversion therapy practices that is inclusive of both gender and sexuality, and then outlines 6 principles by which this could be done within curriculums or represented in curriculums. And so we asked then medical schools to sign up to it, and we've got, I think off the press there is somebody signing up again, so that's good. So we've got one more towards our goal. I think now there were 44, I think there's now 45 medical schools, and we're sitting at about 38 or 39, maybe 30. I want to say 38 medical schools. I don't know with the new one. I need to figure that out. But around that have signed up. And I authored that with some colleagues, Callum, who is an amazing doctor and student at the time when I met them, Bridget, who's a great educationalist, medical educationalist, is really passionate about these issues. And it honestly came from, and this might be a little bit of a theme you'll notice when you ask me why did I do something, it came from a place of rage, anger, frustration at people's lack of engagement with the issue, including me. And it was shortly after the BMA, I think it was 2021 vote, where the BMA had a motion to get BMA to support the ban that was going through, or attempted ban that was going through Parliament. And a third of doctors in attendance voted against the motion for the BMA to support it. And I was disgusted at that a third of doctors would support the recognised abuse of my community, but also, therefore, and I think this is important, in supporting so-called conversion therapy, they see us as a disease. And I felt like we needed to have some form of principles of change, something that upheld change, something that encouraged schools to take this seriously. And so that's kind of where it was born. Just me in my bedroom, actually, at the time, writing it on a laptop, feeling in a lockdown, I think, very frustrated and angry.
No, it's such great work that you're doing, and it's nice to hear that so many medical schools have signed up, but maybe one day we'll get to all medical schools have signed up for it, I hope. But it's
I hope so. I mean, Yeah, I really hope so. Duncan, Glad themselves are very supportive about pushing this further and still trying to get everybody signed up. So I think it's important. Like, I often get put in the limelight around it because I'm very vocal about it, but it's there's a lot of people who work very hard on the charter to try and get people signed up and schools supporting it and trying to moderate the outrage and aggression we receive for doing it as well. So, yeah, whole host of people have been involved.
I think the point you made about it came from a place of rage as well, and a place of anger. I think that is a good point, because sometimes you do just get really frustrated and angry about something, and that's what empowers you to make a difference and to make a change in something. You don't necessarily have to be calm about it. You can think, I'm actually really annoyed about this, and I think something needs to be done, and that emotion does come across, and your passion about it does come across too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should be ashamed to feel frustration and anger and that be a motivator. I don't think we should let it possess us. I don't think it should be everything. But if we can take that and be like, I'm gonna make this into something else, then we kind of, I suppose for me, it's like we are repurposing, repackaging, redefining our anger and our frustration, right? And we're making it into something that isn't just going to poison us, but we're going to change something with it. And that sounds perhaps easier than it actually is to do. And probably a lot of big ideas in these fields are born from people's anger and frustration. And also I suspect there are a lot of people who, I know there are a lot of people who work in the field similar to me, in that they do have very segmented thinking when it comes to injustice and justice, right and wrong, and find the fence sitting to be an intolerable position for people to take. And I guess, well, I think one of your questions, I think I vaguely remember you saying you wanted to talk about how would you recommend students get into activism. I might have
that's my last question. So you can.
Yeah, well, I'll let you ask it properly in a minute. But I think there's a thing around protecting yourself and around recognizing that if you are someone who's super passionate about this kind of stuff and you do tend to think in struggle with grey, that's always how I describe it to people. I struggle with the greys, right? I struggle with trying to communicate and talk to people in shades of grey. The problem is that's where a lot of the conversations take place, and that's also where a lot of the learning takes place. Because if someone is in sort of an area where they have, and you can ground this in very recognized learning theory, but if someone is in an area where like they're really opposed to the issue that you're trying to educate them on, and that's what we want to educate people, we want to change people's minds. If you just slap them with all the facts and you're quite aggressive with it and like you're really pushy with it, they're not going to learn. Like, we know that. It's the same as if I was to teach you about, I mean, I wouldn't because I don't understand it, but if I was to teach you about kidney function, I'm just choosing something that I know that I have no ability to teach. But if I was to teach you about that, I'm not just going to slap high level nephrology at you, right? I have to start with the basics. I have to move you through. I have to guide you through to the next bit. And I think if you do struggle with the greys, that's exhausting. And I think has been the cause of some of my burnout in the past, has been not recognizing how taxing it is for me to be able to have those conversations and not just be like boiling inside and frustrated. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the things I often tell people who are interested in this to look out for.
I'll ask you the question now.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to students who want to become involved in activism surrounding marginalised individuals and communities, other than all the great advice that you've just given?
I think the first thing I would say is that is whether or not you want to be involved in activism. If you are involved in healthcare, you're involved in the politics of healthcare. Healthcare is an inherently political issue. The World Health Organization itself has defined health inequality or health inequity as a political decision. It is the result of bad politics. When you have the resources to correct something and you choose not to, this is bad politics, right? It is where you've placed value upon something else. So if you're involved in healthcare, you cannot claim that you can be apolitical. You cannot be neutral. There is no neutrality. Neutrality is not something that exists. Whatever the issue that you're trying to bring out or talk about, inaction is action, right? Your lack of engagement does not make you innocent of the crime. If I was to be the good example of me going straight into the black and white thinking. But, that is important to understand. We all have a role to play, and that role might be different for different people, but we all need to be engaged in this. So the first thing is that probably you're all activists in some way when it comes to health, because if you're advocating for patients and marginalised people, you are engaged in forms of activism. And if you're not, then I would say you're engaged in forms of activism just in the opposite direction. Now, one of the things I do think is important is to consider what and why you're doing something. So I guess I want to give you an example from my own work. So I have done and have spoken about anti-racism in healthcare practices and around challenging the experiences of racism in universities for people from a global majority background. And in case it wasn't clear to the listener, I am just overwhelmingly white. Like, I am not someone who would or could ever experience racism. Now, that means that when I work in that field, there's a lot of learning for me to do. There's a lot of ways for me to consider, and I've not always got this right at all. But I have to consider, how am I going to, is this one the right thing for me to be doing? And I have sometimes had critique from people who will say, why are you an EDI lead? Because you're white. And my answer is because, well, EDI is a vast and complex area of intersecting identities, and race and ethnicity are a vital part of challenging white supremacy, but it's not the only part of it. There's also an important role for people who are the beneficiaries of a form of oppression to be part of the issue of dismantling it. But recognizing that I had a role to play, I then had to think about, how am I going to do that? And a huge part of it for me was learning that I wasn't, whilst I did my best to not be actively racist, I wasn't anti-racist. And my students did a huge amount of work with me, which I've done my best to give them reciprocal benefits where I can, whether that's pay or other opportunities and things like that. But they mentored me in their experiences and helped guide me towards what I needed to do for them, and co-produced a lot of work with me. And it's my responsibility to implement it and to challenge and to do those things. But I had to be informed by them, as well as engaging myself in education around literature and, importantly, media. That's a huge thing to be engaged with. So if you do find yourself in the position of undertaking activism whereby which you need to advocate or be part of activism for a group you're not personally part of, I think you need to think really carefully about, how are you going to learn? How are you going to create space but not take up space? What does it look like to be able to take the feedback that you've got it wrong? Because you will. So I think that's super important. The other thing I think to recognize in activism is that I do a lot of LGBT and sort of queer health activism, right? But I only represent one small part of that community. And so again, my voice has to be moderated by my need to understand and create space for other people. So I think try not to go into activism feeling like you're going to solve the world's problems and that you're going to represent everybody and that you can make, it's a long, arduous process of self-reflection, self-correction, and be doing your best. I often, when I do teaching on topics of, for instance, bystander skills, but I do some work with in my school, or decolonization, one of the things sometimes people say to me is that they don't do stuff because they want to do it, but they're scared of getting it wrong. So I'm really I want to use the right language, but I'm really scared I'm going to get it wrong. I really want to try and change my teaching to do that, but I'm really worried I'm going to do it badly. And my answer to them is always probably, well, you will. Like, you probably will. I, as a queer activist, still misgender people every now and then, or don't use language that is the language I want to be advocating for, because I was brought up in a system by which that was the place, right? Like, I'm indoctrinated into it. What I think is important is to recognize that when you do this work, it isn't just about, like, your success is not how often do you get it right, but it's also how do you react when you get it wrong. Do you listen and learn and grow, and if needs be apologize or do what you need to do? Or do you get defensive and fragile and not learn and actually reinforce the forms of oppression you're trying to challenge? So I think it's a deeply vulnerable thing that you need to be doing if you want to engage authentically with activism. I guess my last thing I would say as a tip is that I often get put in the position of people saying to me that I'm too activist to be an academic. I'm too political in some of my work, which, as I've said, I think is right. It's not the there you go. I did swear. I tried really hard. I tried really hard not to. But that's just a form of invalidation that they put out in order to make you feel unwelcome in academic spaces, to make you feel invalidated, to make you feel like your work isn't valued, and because it makes them uncomfortable. And so don't let them. Like, own it. Yeah, fine, I'm very activist for an academic, and I'm quite academic for an activist, or I don't know, however you want to look at it. But both of those things have a role to play in both of those things. Academia has a role to play in activism. Activism has a role to play in academia. They're not separate things, they're overlapping stuff. So just be very wary of people trying to redefine you or to invalidate you doing it from a professionalism perspective, because that's just shit. It's not real. They're just making that up.
Very inspiring. I was having a chat with you and learning about all the stuff that you've been doing and your perspectives. Like I said, I always come away from these learning things and thinking about things and how I can do things in a different way when I'm going out and carrying out the work that I do. And I hope that listeners...
likewise, like, I don't think you understand how impressive the work you're doing right now is. Like, to be doing that and studying medicine and doing everything else you're doing and doing podcasts and being critical of evidence. Like, I barely got through medical school and I was doing none of that. So how you're doing that is beyond me. So, yeah, I mean, equally inspired.
Oh, thank you so much. So yeah, it's been great to chat.
Was it like 20 or 30 quid you said? If I said that, you were gonna pay me?
Yeah, cool. I'll send you the bank transfer afterwards.
Yeah, that's great. Just edit that down.
How can listeners find you if they want to get in touch with you?
Unfortunately, on Twitter. On Twitter, I'm going to call it Twitter, because if Elon dead names his daughter, we'll dead name his platform. So, I'm at.
It's always Twitter.
No, we're not using the word X at all. It's gross. It gives me the ick. So I'm at Hartland Joseph on that. That's predominantly where I am at the moment in regards to kind of my activism and my dissemination of work. I am also on, I can't even remember the name of the website. That's how often I use it. I don't know, there's a website for sharing your academic work. God, I really should be able to name that, but whatever. I'm on, if you Google my name, Joseph Hartland, there's not many of us. It's probably worth noting that a lot of my publications and handles are currently using Joseph, which is my full legal name. I will be aiming to change that in the future to just being J-O for Joe. But at the moment, a lot of my handles and publications are under that. So you can find me on there. Don't look for me on Instagram, because that's just my personal page, and I'm mostly on there to look at pottery and dogs. So you won't see anything useful coming out of my Instagram. So sadly, Twitter is probably the best place to find me. And then, institutionally, I work for the University of Bristol, so I can be contacted for institutional things through their website, where you can find my email address.
Hey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to come on.